Well, joining us now in the studio is the Managing Director of Origin Energy, Grant King, who helped advise the government as part of the Business Roundtable and runs an energy producer and retailer focused on gas and renewables. Grant King, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
You were on the Business Roundtable, as I just said. You're also part of the Business Council of Australia, which wanted a $10 carbon price. Did the government get it right with $23?
Look, I think the government has struck a reasonable balance. As we heard on the prior program, the community has got two quite strongly held views. Some that want to see us make progress on reducing carbon emissions, and some that are very concerned about every dollar that they spend, and our customers tell us that as well. So I think the carbon package, the carbon part of the package, is in about the right place. It will cause some change, not as quick as some would like, but that price together with the offsetting measures, I think, is a reasonable package.
You talk about the package because I know a couple of years ago you said, in fact more recently than that if they wanted to achieve their 5% cut in reductions on 2,000 emissions by 2020 on price alone, you'd need a price in the $40 to $60 category. So you believe that there are enough other mitigating factors around that price to make it work?
Yes, there's three phases. If you think about how to reduce carbon, there's sort of three phases in the process. The first is we have to change the capital that we're going to spend in the future, particularly to generate energy. And in fact, a very simple carbon scheme and a starting price of $1 would do that. That would cause us to change the way we spend capital in the future. If we want to change the way we use our current power stations and change the energy we use, change the fuel we use and the way we use them, that's what this scheme will cause us to do, and it will start that process and it will accelerate the rate at which we reduce carbon emissions. And of course, if we want to make even quicker changes, it would take a much, much higher price, maybe $40 or $50, because we would need to retire assets that are already in production. And I think that third phase is frankly beyond what we could tolerate and accept as a community in terms of a carbon price necessary to do it. And I think that's why we see one of the features of the scheme as a discussion with some carbon-intensive generators as to whether we can withdraw them early from the system. So I think that's a more sensible discussion to have. It would take a much higher price to move us into that third phase of carbon reduction, to accelerate carbon reduction.
It's hard for people to, I suppose, get a handle on what it means when there are such differing opinions, and you're saying it's a reasonable place to start, but other companies, for example Rio Tinto, they say it's going to hinder jobs growth, it's going to hinder investment, and it's not really going to have any impact on global emissions. In fact, they call it a policy experiment. What we're hearing from the big coal miners, I mean, how do we reconcile that with what you're saying? Are they scaremongering?
Well, I think the reconciliation is a bit different than the question you've just asked. In respect of households, I think households have been reasonably and sensibly dealt with, and as the government has said, more than 50% of the revenue raised from the scheme will go to household compensation. Business is in quite a different position, and two other features of the package. So we've got at the core of the package what will ultimately be a carbon trading scheme. But around that package is some important elements that are using the revenue that's raised, and two of those elements is how much money goes, for example, to help research and development in renewable energy, and how much goes to assist business. Now, in that respect, I think there's a much bigger call being made about whether that distributional aspect is right.
Do you think it's right?
Well, right now a lot of money is going to renewables at the expense of helping business make the transition, and that is an experiment. There's no way of knowing whether the answer is right today in prospect. But I think a very, very important part of the package that's announced is the review processes which the government's announced, particularly the Productivity Commission review. And I think it's imperative that that first round of review, which I think is in 2014-2015, with much more evidence on the table, looks very carefully at that question of how have we made that distributional choice and have we got it right. It would be a bad outcome for Australia if we got it wrong, because we would disadvantage our industries and we would perhaps commit us to a much higher cost of reducing carbon emissions. So I think that explains the difference in view. I think the government has concentrated on the household sector, and I think got a reasonable outcome there. But business has been asked to accept a cost of transition, which in the fullness of time may or may not prove to be right.
Do you believe some sectors in business, though, as Tony Wood suggested, are crying wolf?
Well, look, it's for each company to make its claim, and as I would in respect of our own business, I would say each company has the right to do so. It knows its own business, the steel industry, for example, the coal industry, the LNG industry, in which we participate. I know our numbers, and we believe, for example, the LNG industry has been shortchanged in respect of that distributional question, how much assistance do we get? That's a case for each company or each sector to make.
Well, let's look at LNG, because you are part of this joint venture building this massive LNG project in Queensland. You'll be 50% compensated, but of course your international competitors don't pay a tax at all. Doesn't bother you? All factored into the business plan?
Well, I think, as I said earlier, I think many elements of this package are reasonable. I would say logical in the context of all of the needs that have been satisfied. But some elements of the package are a little bit ideological. and that's because there's a view that some of our coal and gas, which are seen to be fossil fuels, should be discouraged at the expense of renewable energy. Now, that's what I say. That's a big call to make that call. But part of that ideological view, I think, is seeing the transitional assistance for LNG short of where it should be.
But does this hurt you? Does it make it uncompetitive?
Again, that'll be tested in the fullness of time. The specific circumstances we're in is we won't be in production until 2015, 2016. That will be after the first review period. We'll know what's happening, or we'll know more of what's happening in the rest of the world. So that's a question that will need to be answered at that time. But that's why I make the point very strongly that a part of the overall package is review processes by an independent body, the Productivity Commission, which I think business has a degree of confidence in. And it's imperative that those review processes are robust and can, with the knowledge of another couple of years, revisit this question of whether the allocation is right.
Would you have liked to have seen some sort of commitment that government would have to adopt the recommendations of the Productivity Commission reviews? Because at the moment, of course, they can be ignored. Yeah,
I would always like to see governments adopt sensibly based conclusions, but I'd be surprised if governments subordinated their responsibilities in that respect.
What was it like sitting around the business roundtable? I mean, was it some trying to go the middle way? I assume that might have been where you were, and the steel people over here yelling one thing and the coal people over here yelling another. What was the whole process of consultation like?
I think you'd make two observations, or those involved would probably make two observations. Those that felt very strongly about the issues spoke strongly about the issues, and from both industry and government side, their strongly held views were articulated, I think, with great strength. I think many of us in business would say in a forum where there's 40 or so people that meet for 2 hours, that's not going to see any outcome or any decision made. And I think the way to think about that roundtable process was that it did at least home in on where some key issues were, and did set up subsequent conversations that tried to work on the details. So, one of the features of this scheme now compared to 2009 is the withdrawal of generation capacity. So that was something that came out of those processes. And I think the additional assistance for steel industry was something that you could say came out of those processes.
You could argue he who yells the loudest gets the most.
I'd like to think that he who makes the most, or she for that matter, who makes the most cogent case is the one who, as I say, logic should prevail. Doesn't always, but logic should prevail.
But of course, as we talked about earlier with Tony Woods, there's a $10 billion Clean Energy Finance Corporation to encourage investment in renewables. Do you fear that this does amount to picking winners?
Well, the literal description of that Clean Energy Finance Corporation, in fact, adds a substantially important new feature, and that is a low emissions component of that fund. And I think in the language of it, it sort of implies that it's 50-50, actually. It's about 50% renewables and 50% low emissions. And that's a really important change because, in our view, there's actually a lot of easier choices to make. It isn't been as extreme as replacing coal-fired power stations with renewable energy ones. It is about substituting the various fuels and technologies we have for more carbon intensive to be substituted with less carbon intensive. So that's an important feature. I think it's important that the mechanism that's been used to bring forward renewable energy, which is the renewable energy target, being a market-based mechanism, will clear the most cost-competitive technologies, but it may not allow other technologies to demonstrate what they can do. Now, properly managed and administered, and it comes back to that same point, the right group of people, the right governance arrangements should be able to use such a fund for an appropriate purpose. But that is nearly always a great challenge to do so. Will
renewables and clean energy in our lifetime replace baseload power?
Well, I'm hoping that I'll live for a very long time, but this will be a slow transition. Because at the end of the day, I know above all other things that our customers want a reliable supply of energy as well, and we're not willing to jeopardise the reliability and security of our system, I think, for some other purpose. So I think we want to we do want to see a reasonable balance. We want to make progress in decarbonising our fuel, but we do want to preserve a reliable, competitive supply of energy for our customers. So it will take a long time.
You've made a lot about the fact that this does at least provide some certainty for business and certainly certainty for investment. A question I put to Tony Woods, do you worry, though, that that certainty is not permanent, given that the opposition has vowed to repeal this entire package?
Yeah, look, that degree of uncertainty, that's a form of political uncertainty, I guess. The scheme itself, should it be implemented, it does say a lot more to us about the sorts of technologies society wants us to use. Look, we will have to sit back and make some judgments about that. I think the important thing to understand in our industry is we make decisions that take years to implement. It takes 5 to 10 years to plan, permit, design, build and commission a power station. So there's a little bit of time yet. That's a judgment we'll have to make. The legislation is intended to be in place and effective July next year, If that was to be the case, then I think that's the time we'll have to make that judgment. The scheme itself does answer quite a few of the questions that we would want to know about what sort of investments does society want us to make, but I accept that there is still a degree of political uncertainty about that.
Do you believe that if it was passed, the legislation was passed, if it was put in place, that it could be repealed, lock, stock and barrel?
Look, So I think the simple answer to that question is if you're asking one day after it's passed, could it be changed? The answer is yes. The further we get into it, the more complex the system has become, the more decisions that are being made based on that world, it will be hard to unwind.
Grant King, many thanks for talking to Lateline tonight.
Thank you.